There we go. And we're live. Hello, everybody.
Hi,
What's up, Amber O'Hearn?
not too much.
I'm so glad to have you
Just
on. It's been a long time. We talked a few months ago, and everybody's really excited to hear about what we've got to talk about today. I think this is a really important topic. We've got two topics that we want to touch on today, and this was kind of sparked from a Twitter post that Amber had made saying that she doesn't hold the same views anymore about protein for satiety. So I used to talk about the protein leverage hypothesis, and this is something that I've mentioned many times to clients because I get a lot of people who've been doing a ketogenic diet, under eating on protein, not getting enough protein, overeating on like refined oils and fats and stuff, and that's a really common problem in the keto community. But I might be wrong in the way that I've been describing how protein affects satiety. And Amber O'Hearn's been doing some deep research on this. And we also want to get into the word nutrient density because we might also be wrong, and I might be wrong as well, in my use of the term nutrient density. It's been a term that I've used for a few years now, but it's starting to bother me for some reason. And Amber might be able to pinpoint exactly why it is that I think that nutrient density might not be the best word to be applying to this stuff. So we're super excited to talk about this. I know I'm about to get my mind blown. Siobhan's in the chat, and she says Tristan's about to get his mind blown. I think we're all about to get our mind blown. So Amber O'Hearn, you've been on a carnivore diet for like 10 years now, right?
getting close. I discovered it just over 10 years ago and I had a little bit of a break, and so I like to call my start date at the end of 2009, but yeah, pretty much a decade.
You're so honest. You're so honest. You know, so many other people would they'll embellish it. They'll turn them 10 years into 20, the 20 into 40. In the internet age, right? Everyone, you go vegan and you've been vegan for 10 years after your first 12 months somehow. But yeah, so Amber, what's going on with this protein thing? The protein and satiety I've talked about. Oh, excuse me. The protein, yeah,
Gesundheit.
thank you. The protein leverage hypothesis, a lot. And what the heck's going on here? Why might this not be the best way to describe what's happening?
Well, I think there are definitely some good things about it, and I also have invoked protein leverage in the past because we never want to underemphasize the importance of protein. We need protein for everything that we do. And um, even I think people who are following a fairly low protein diet are going to be able to identify when they're having something that I would just call protein hunger, because you can't get by with none. But the protein leverage hypothesis specifically was a hypothesis about why, well, I think it started in primates actually. So they had these clever experiments with, might have been chimpanzees in the wild. I'm not sure. It was actually done over a variety of species to find out if there was anything that was constant over the changing environment that caused them to eat different amounts of food at different times. And a lot of people have found observationally that in different animals, including humans, there does seem to be this kind of constant amount of protein in terms of percent of the calories of the diet that a lot of people settle on. Although not everything falls into that quite as neatly as you might think. So then what happened was there was this really clever paper by Simpson and Rabenheimer in 2005 using the protein leverage hypothesis to explain the obesity epidemic. And the basic idea was if you have this sort of constant need for protein, and your diet can be characterized as having a certain percent of protein in it, and they would use like an arc, very much like what Ted Naiman does, where you have this axis, and this arc is showing where on the protein versus energy level that your diet is. So you can eat more and more along this arc, but the percent of protein is going to stay the same. Um, so what that means is if you have this constant need for protein, and your hunger is really trying to address getting that amount of protein, and you're not going to reach satiety until you get it, then if your diet happens to be lower in protein by percent, you're just going to have to eat more to get enough protein. And by the way, that will mean you're going to have to eat more energy. And so this will turn out to be extra energy as extra calories, and it's going to make you fat. So this is the form of the protein leverage hypothesis that I have some issues with for various reasons.
Yeah, and that's actually that's what I've been citing for so long. I tell people, look, if you undereat on protein, you're going to end up likely overeating on other macronutrients, right? So you look at the standard American diet, seems to be relatively low in protein, super high in both carbohydrate and fat, and then they're in almost like a weaponized form against our palate that makes them hyper palatable and makes it really easy to overeat on them. Um, so
Yes, yes.
yeah, so yeah, where are we going
So
wrong
you want
here?
to bring up that graphic?
Yeah, graphic number one. Let's see, slide number
So,
one. There we
oh,
go.
there it is. So this is from that paper from Simpson and Robenheimer, and you can see it has those trajectories coming out with they figure that about 14% protein is what a lot of people are settling at. And they have, so up in the top corner, they have, the top left corner, they have one where the black circle is supposed to be how much protein you need and where you would be if you were eating a 14% protein diet. And then they say, well, suppose that your diet suddenly became diluted in protein, your protein level would have to stay the same, so you'd shift up and you'd be getting all those extra calories. So one of the questions that comes out of that is, well, why don't people just, if what they're hungry for is protein, why don't they just become hungry for more protein foods? Like, why don't they say, I don't want that wheat, I want a burger. Um, and the explanation that they gave is quite similar to what you gave. The food is tricking you by being hyperpalatable. And especially, they even mentioned that it would have some kind of umami mimicky sensation. So you go after it because you have this feeling that it might be giving you more protein based on its taste profile, but in fact, it actually isn't. And maybe there is something to that. In this particular context, maybe that works. But I think that the hint about where the problem comes is when you look at that y-axis, which is carbohydrate plus fat. And the thing is that carbohydrates and fat, while they're both sources of energy, they don't really have the same effect on your hormones when you eat one versus when you eat the other. And so this is where I think the problem begins.
Now, what effect on your hormones do we see when you eat, carbohydrate versus fat? What do you mean there?
Well, let's look at the next slide because it was in looking at this paper. It's a very classic paper. It's 2007. It's from Kennedy et al. And it's called something like a high-fat ketogenic diet induces a unique metabolic state in mice. And so it's one of the first studies that really did great analysis on getting mice ketogenic and figuring out what's going on. And so this slide just describes the different diets. You can see at the bottom, the chow has 26.8% protein. They gave three different diets ad libitum.
Mm-hmm.
So the mice were allowed to eat as much as they wanted, but the pellets were all the same with respect to the nutritional
Mm-hmm.
profile. So they had this regular chow, they had a high fat diet, which was 24% protein, and it was high fat and high carb, and because they wanted to differentiate high fat versus high
So yeah,
fat
that's
and high
like the
carb.
balanced diet, right? 45% fat, 24% protein, 35% carbohydrate. Which sounds about like if I'm trying to gain weight.
That's the gain weight
That's,
diet.
if I'm
Yeah,
trying to gain weight, that's exactly what I do, right?
right. And then the ketogenic diet where it actually had no carbohydrate and 95% fat and 5% protein. And so they let them eat ad libitum. And if you look at the next slide, here's the part that caught my eye when I was looking at it one time. Besides, they have a note here saying that on the first day, the high fat mice ate twice as much as usual.
Hmm.
But after that, it all settled out, and all the mice ended up eating almost exactly the same amount of calories at the end but after that first day and by the end of the experiment, on a date on the last day, and also as a kind of mean over the whole experiment,
Mm-hmm.
they ate the same amount. That directly contradicts the protein leverage hypothesis, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the mice did not eat the mice on the ketogenic diet did not eat 5 times as
Right.
much in order to get their 25% protein.
Okay. Now, what?
So
Well, they're mice, right? Well, don't mice have a different hormonal response than humans? And I mean, that would probably be a something that somebody could bring up. Like if I was playing Ted Naiman right now, well, we're not mice.
right, no, that's absolutely true. This was just the first hint that made me think, well, maybe this isn't exactly the same. And I think that it actually has to do with the amount of fat. My guess is that, you know, the mice may indeed have been feeling like they wanted more protein, but they hit this limit of I just cannot eat any more of that fat
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and continue to get that protein. And it's ambiguous to me whether what their result is a chronic protein deficit that's been enforced by that high fat, or whether that's actually enough protein for them. And I think it must be because I don't think that they were unable to grow or having any kind of problem like that.
Mm-hmm.
But when you talk about, you asked like what in people causes satiety. I think that is the next logical step to look at mechanistically.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there are specifically satiety inducing hormones. And actually, It's the Woo has a great series of posts on this from last year. Her blog's called The Scribble Pad, and she talks about uh, two particular satiety hormones, the CCK, which is called cholecystokinin, I think is what it stands for. And basically, you have these receptors in the gut that are trying to pick up signals about what you're eating, and they will induce satiety based on what they're finding. And the thing that she notes in there is that fat induces CCK way, way more than protein, and both of them much, much, much more than carbohydrate.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's clue number one that satiety itself is is not as well affected by protein as by fat. And she also talks about ghrelin, which is kind of an appetite hormone. When you are getting hungry, your ghrelin your ghrelin goes. I'm not going to get this backwards. Yeah, right. So the more that it goes up,
Mm-hmm.
the more ghrelin goes up. I'm looking back at my whiteboard here to cheat. The more your hunger goes up. And the really fun thing that she found in that post was that protein actually increases ghrelin. It actually causes more hunger.
Hmm.
Fat decreases it. Carbohydrates decrease it, but they decrease it for a very short term. So if you're looking at just a carbohydrate dose alone, you get this satiety, but then an hour and a half later you're hungry again,
Okay.
or the ghrelin comes back. Whereas fat has this long-term effect. So there's two ways that you could look at satiety. As another thing that will cause CCK to be received and thereby promote satiety is fiber, and I think that happens by action of the short chain fatty acids that are being delivered directly. So that would also be because of the fat. And um, ketone bodies alone, beta hydroxybutyrate, might actually be modulating the effect of CCK. So we all know that a ketogenic diet has this effect on appetite,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really just another way of saying it promotes satiety,
Yep.
right? And so that's one of the ways that it does that.
Now, what some people would say, well, when people get on a ketogenic diet, they're usually eating more protein than they would be on a standard American diet, assuming that they're getting sufficient protein. So that would be, kind of um, the I would say excuse, but the explanation that people would give for the satiety induction, right? And then also got the insulin to glucagon ratio changing. How does this tie in there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, insulin and glucagon, a long time ago, in 2012 or 2013, I wrote a series of posts about gluconeogenesis, trying to provide some clarity there because at the time, the whole blogosphere and keto sphere was saying you can't eat
Yeah.
protein because um, it's just going to turn directly into sugars and as you have too much of it.
Exactly. And that's why the
And so,
protein leverage hypothesis, it's a really good way of illustrating the importance of protein to people. But if you take that away from me, how am I going to help these people who are under eating on protein? I'm so freaked out.
yeah,
I'm
there
kidding.
is a bit of a balance to hit,
Yeah.
but and in fact, in those posts, and I haven't really changed my mind about this, although I would definitely talk about it differently now than I would then
Hmm.
because of all the confusion that I know that I added to. So I started talking about it as demand driven,
Hmm.
and so I said in these posts, gluconeogenesis is not supply driven, it's demand
And
driven.
I
And what
used
I
those
meant,
exact words so many times from reading your posts, right? Like, your post influenced me heavily, especially 2014, 2015, when a lot of people were freaking out about the protein and overeating on the fat.
yeah, and I still think it's true, but I think we've lost a little bit about what it means to be demand driven. So let me be just a little bit more specific. So the distinction that I was trying to get was you don't make sugar just because the opportunity is there,
Hmm.
just because you have the materials. And I even showed some experiments where it was in vitro and they gave liver cells the opportunity to make glucose given the right material. And it doesn't just happen automatically because the material's there. It's got to be in the right signaling state. And so by demand driven, what we really mean is we don't necessarily mean we need sugar because that's a kind of higher level of abstraction. What we mean is the body is demanding sugar by decreasing the insulin to glucagon ratio.
Hmm.
So basically the control of how much gluconeogenesis you're doing and how much ketogenesis you're doing because they're together. That's another thing that I think there's a lot of confusion about. So if something is driving up gluconeogenesis, then it's also driving up
Yeah,
ketogenesis.
they're a coupled
They're
process, and
hooked together.
yeah, right. You couldn't
Hmm.
have a healthy ketogenic state without gluconeogenesis, and this is what people miss. They get afraid of your body creating glucose, but they don't realize that it's vitally important that your body can create glucose.
Right. And so part of the confusion, I think, was talking about blood sugar going up versus sugar being made. And so I gave you one of my posts from that series that is, I
It's
think,
the
kind of helpful
fourth
for that.
screenshot. Let's see. This one?
Yeah, that one. So
There we go.
what it says is there's there's evidence that I over G, the insulin to glucagon ratio, and not the absolute levels of those hormones, is what's actually regulating glucose production. And then I have this chart that I got from a paper by Mueller from 1971.
Mm.
And what they did was they they had some people who they put on a low carb diet, and they had people who were fasting, and they had people on a regular diet, and they measured their glucose and their insulin and their glucagon, and then their I over G molar ratio, right?
Hmm. This is a
And
study
then they
that
gave
that
them
Bickman likes to quote, right? And he talks about this quite a bit. Benjamin Bickman.
He does. So his presentation of this material is much more compelling than this post ever was. He has beautiful graphics, and it's available from the Low Carb Breckenridge site. He didn't use the same paper, but he came to the same conclusions because the data is the data, and
Hmm.
it didn't change. So in this particular experiment, they gave it's a kind of similar thing to what he's talking about. They gave each of those groups a bolus of protein, and that was lean beef at a value of 1 gram per kilogram of their body weight, I think. So probably something close to your whole amount that you would need in a day. And I don't know if you can see those figures very well, but what it's showing is that the ketogenic dieters, they're starting with an I over G of about 1.7. And after that bolus of protein, it barely
Yep,
moves. It's like
1.8. Yeah.
1.83. And whereas the glycolytic dieters, as I like to call them, they started with slightly over 4, and it doubled after their protein
Yeah.
bolus. But
So totally
the other
different
interesting
response as
thing,
far
though,
as hormonal response to protein in a high fat state as opposed to the hormonal response to protein in a glucose driven metabolism is completely different, which is pretty fascinating, especially when you look at um, just all the associations that people make of protein being bad for you. Connecting mTOR and protein. There's a lot of demonization of protein that goes on, and I think this adds some nuance to it that should be explored.
right? And so the one of the things that Ben Beekman really emphasized when he was presenting this material is that since the I over G ratio is what's controlling ketogenesis in the first place, if eating some protein doesn't really budge it, then it's not going to affect your ketogenesis. So it's not going to kick you out of
Yeah.
ketosis. There's a little bit of nuance though. Um, one part of it has to do with something else that's in this chart that he didn't really talk about, and that is the response of um, blood glucose to protein. So it's well known that, and I think a lot of people like to quote it, that protein doesn't budge your blood sugar. You don't really normally have a blood sugar response to protein. But it turns out that that also changes when you're on a ketogenic diet. So that is not true on a high carb diet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean that is true. That is, protein does not raise blood sugar typically in a high carb regular diet. But if you're on a ketogenic diet, it actually does raise blood glucose. Now, it doesn't raise it out of bounds, it doesn't make it
Yeah.
crazy, but you're going to see this blood sugar response that you wouldn't see if you were on a high carb diet.
Right.
And the significance of that, um, combined with the the fact that even though the I over G didn't really change much, it changed a little bit, is something that I think helps put all of this together into a bigger picture, because we do know that you can't just eat a, an infinite amount of protein, or an unlimited, let's say,
Yeah.
amount of protein, and stay in ketosis. There, something happens somewhere along the
Yeah,
way.
exactly. The
And what
ketones will
I
drop.
think,
The ketones will drop a little bit, and
mhm,
the blood glucose will go up after a huge protein bolus. Now, if you're having less meal frequency, it usually not such a big deal, right? You have one meal a day, and it's a huge protein bolus. People are in ketosis most of the day, but some people do notice that, even 3 meals a day, every single time they have that meal, glucose goes up, and their ketones will go down. Not that I think it's important to be measuring ketones all the time, but this is what people are observing.
right, right. And I think I like to think of it a bit like compound interest. So supposing that the I over G, when you give it some protein, it goes up a tiny bit. Maybe it only goes up like 5%. But if you keep doing that over and over and over again, it's like with your bank account, a little bit compounded over and over and over again eventually adds up to something. And I think that's um, where people might go wrong if they say, look, Ben Beekman proved that if you add protein, nothing happens. But the fact is that a tiny, tiny bit happens, and at some point, that's going to be enough to throw you off.
Now, what about in the state of like somebody being highly insulin resistant?
So, if you mean by insulin resistant hyperinsulinemic, then then I think that really has a huge effect here. If you, for example, started out as a diabetic and you've gotten most of your markers down, but your basal insulin level just really hasn't come
Yeah.
down the way that, and I think that is one of the last things to heal, really. Then that means that's going to affect your I over G ratio, because you have to have that much more glucagon to keep it down. And so if you were starting, I'm making these numbers up,
Yeah.
but if you were starting at an I over G ratio of something that's more like 2, so it's definitely less than than the glycolytic situation, but it's more than the typical ketogenic situation, then it stands to reason that you're just going to be that much more sensitive to protein.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely noticed that. People who've got a lot of body fat to lose, well, first of all, they can do less frequent meals and go long periods of time without those meals, be burning body fat a lot easier. But also, some of them tend to, with higher meal frequency and with, super intense protein intakes, they can feel like crap after a meal. They feel that insulin resistant feeling.
Yeah. And so that really, I think, segues into a really important way of looking at this. So if you if you're eating high protein and it gets to the point where it's high enough that for you it's starting to slow down ketogenesis, in other words, it's raising your insulin to glucagon levels to a certain
Hmm.
point, all of a sudden you're going to be more hungry because, and maybe this isn't the exact reason, maybe there are multiple reasons, but one way of looking at it is this. If your if your glucagon is high relative to your insulin, that means you're able to release more fat out of your fat
Hmm.
cells, and that means you're getting all this energy. Why would you be hungry if you're accessing all? But if the I over G is slightly more, you might just get to the point where the fat excess, if your adipose tissue is particularly sensitized to this, it might just say, okay, that's enough, and all of a sudden you're more hungry. You're going to start wanting to eat more, even if it's protein, because you have to get your energy from somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I think that might be what comes behind the observation that I've experienced personally. And I know Josh Blackburn and others have experienced it, where the more protein you eat, suddenly the more appetite you have. And 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 if you switch those ratios such that you're eating more fat um, fat actually stimulates glucagon and doesn't do anything to insulin. So if you
Hmm.
just ate fat all by itself, that actually should release more fat from your own adipose tissues than if you ate nothing at all.
Interesting. But now, assuming you're not doing a huge bolus of fat that doesn't allow you to tap into those adipose tissues, right? I mean, even in, because you do see, like, the coconut oil guzzlers and the MCT, half a cup of MCT a day type stuff. People are trying to lose weight. Well, why am I not losing weight? You.
Right, right. There's always so much nuance, but it's really hard to it's hard to hit the right balance in terms of giving people advice about what to do. Because if you tell them to eat a lot of fat because it's going to help reduce their insulin to glucagon ratios and actually release more fat from their body, there is going to come a point where the amount of fat that's going in it's not going to prevent fat from coming out of their body, but it's going to create a balance because there isn't more needed.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, so yeah, it is nuanced, and I guess you just got to look at the individual situation and see what a person was doing, the results they were getting, and manipulate the factors in accordance with that to try to create that concert of effects that'll lead to the result that they want.
Right. So I personally have experienced, for example, much greater satiation and satiety, which it has enabled me to run a calorie deficit for days on end as long as I'm eating a lot of fat. Whereas if I were actually fasting, or God forbid, doing a protein sparing modified fast, which makes me crazy, by the way, it tanks my mood, it makes me hungry, it makes me irritable.
That's funny because
Um,
yesterday when I talked to Michaela Peterson, she said the same thing. Not enough fat, too much protein. She gets hangry like after a meal. It's just like I need that fat. And I
yeah.
get the same way. It's like if I don't have enough fat, if I'm not able to get some good animal fats, or if I run out of I like to use butter. I'm fine with butter. And but if my source dries up, I find myself more hungry, and I'll add more carbohydrates, to some digestible carbohydrates if I can't get those fats.
So I wanted to take a brief look at a very old classic study that I gave you a slide for as well. It's from Keckwick and Pawan from 1956. That's it. Yeah. So this is a really cool study. They didn't know what was going on, and we weren't at the level of speculation about satiety or about glucose or glucagon or insulin. But all they did was they had these series of observations by changing the ratios of these are calorie restricted diets. So they have overweight people, and they've given them different diets, and they also did a lot of stuff with changing the order of the diets and all kinds of things. But it's 1,000 calorie diet, so obviously a deficit, and it's either 90% carbohydrate, 90% protein, or 90% fat, or they gave them a kind of mixed to the regular level
Mm-hmm.
of eating. And I don't think it says in the paper exactly where the rest of the calories, what that 10% was, but you can see pretty clearly from this graph here. This is just showing the amount of body weight on average per day that the people were experiencing. And the 90% carbohydrate diet at 1,000 calories a day, which you would think would help you lose weight,
Mm-hmm.
is basically a wash. You don't even lose weight. How frustrating is
Well,
that?
that's
You're
weird.
hungry
Because
and
what about the potato diet thing? Remember, you know that who was it? The guy who put everybody they put them on just potatoes, just white rice. They were getting weight loss and reversal of diabetes allegedly. I haven't looked at the
yeah.
study.
Well, there are different things that could come into play in that situation. We could speculate. I don't know enough about it.
I haven't
There
looked
could
into
be
it
an
either. It
effect
just
from
comes
the,
up as one of those things that a lot of people talk about. Well, look, yeah, we know keto might work for diabetes, but look, super high carb also works. And you're like, well, okay, all potatoes, all rice. I mean, how long can one really do that for? Um,
that's true. And this is very short term. It's just, I think it's a week or a couple
yeah.
weeks. Yeah, 5 to 9 days, actually.
Okay.
Um, but you can also see the second and third one with 90% protein and 90% fat. You might be surprised to find out that the ones who ate the more fat actually lost more weight. It's kind of counter to the whole idea that if you're supplying your body with fat, that's directly subtracting from the fat that's coming off your body.
Yeah.
And it just does not seem to be the case at all.
And the
So
the
the
mixed diet, the
explanation,
mixed diet was better than the high carb, right?
yeah,
That's weird.
yeah.
Very interesting. Well, I'm sorry, I interrupted. What was the explanation?
I was just going to say the explanation that I offered earlier to you just now was that maybe it's actually the glucagon that so the fat is stimulating glucagon only, the protein stimulating insulin and glucagon. So maybe it's just making you that much more ketogenic, which is allowing you that much more release of your own fat. Um, but I don't know. Um,
That's fascinating.
this doesn't directly relate to satiety. You might argue that it doesn't, at least because here all of these people had to eat this exact amount of calories, so satiety doesn't come into play. And part of the argument when you're talking about protein leverage or anything, even the high carbs, so the PKD style, a ketogenic diet where you're eating very high fat, part of the whole argument of those is that it creates satiety so that you naturally eat less. And that obviously can't come into play here. But one thing that I was thinking about was what does that satiety mean if it means that you are no longer getting signals that you need energy and you're no longer getting signals that you need protein, then that should induce more satiety, right? And so you can maybe kind of make a backwards inference by saying on the diet where they were losing weight faster, they had more access to energy, and so maybe they felt more satiety as well. Although we wouldn't really know until we saw them on the same ratios and let them eat as much as they wanted.
Yeah, and has anyone ever done a study like that? Ad libitum feeding with macronutrient ratios adjusted as such?
I don't know that they have. That would be an excellent study and would really, I
Yeah.
think, clear things up a lot.
Yeah.
Actually, come to think of it, to be fair, I think Ted Naiman has shown some studies where the one-to-one protein to fat ratio did cause greater fat loss ad libitum.
Is that
I'll have to ask him about that.
calories or grams? Okay.
Grams.
So yeah, that ends up
Oh, the ratios. Don't get me started on how confusing
it
that
gets
is.
so confusing for everybody, right? So when you're looking at
Mm-hmm.
90% fat ratio, that probably ends up being about 2 grams of fat per gram of protein, right? Or 2 grams of fat per gram of protein would end up being about 90% fat calorically. Am I wrong on that?
I think it's around 82.
Okay. And
82.
and that's what the
Yeah, so somebody asked me yesterday, so if I have 70/30 ground beef, isn't that way too much protein? And I had to say, well, actually, no, that turns out to be around 70%
Hmm.
calories of fat. And I went through all the calculations, how the 70-30 means you've got 70 grams of lean meat per 30 grams of fat, but the lean meat has only about a quarter of a gram of protein per gram of lean. And then,
Uh-huh.
so it's so confusing.
70, I find that the 70-30, some of it's good, but some of it some of it I prefer the 80 percent or the 80-20 to. What about you? Like when you buy it, you go for 70-30 or 80-20 or 85 or whatever.
Um, it really depends what I'm gonna do with it. I really love eating ground beef
Hmm.
raw, and when I do that, I much prefer the
Yeah.
fatter. But if I'm gonna cook it, the fat just kind of pours out and becomes this liquid grease in the pan that then isn't as fun to drink that way. And so I actually prefer a leaner grind if I'm gonna cook it a
Yeah.
lot.
Nice. Nice. So, yeah, this is fascinating. I think it's just so interesting that the 1,000 calories a day mixed diet end up getting better results than that 90% carbohydrate diet. To me, that's fascinating as far as the weight loss goes. So, I mean, did they mess with meal timing on this at all, or was it just
Not that I know
okay?
of.
Yeah, that's really really interesting. So, yeah, so insulin to glucagon ratio doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, looking at the response of insulin to glucagon when you're looking at protein on a ketogenic diet as opposed to a carbohydrate based diet can be important, but it's not the big picture. So, protein bringing satiety, right? I mean, I'm not convinced yet that saying protein is the best satiety inducing macro. I'm not 100% convinced yet that that's incorrect. Um, it does it.
Well,
Go ahead.
you should try eating two grams of fat for every gram of protein and tell me how much you can eat.
Okay.
Um, for me, it's
Yeah.
less. Um, but I really think that we have hunger. Hunger is kind of ill-defined. It's vague, and there is a hunger that I experience. When we were talking just a minute ago about on the protein-sparing modified fast, you get this hangry
Yeah.
thing for energy, right? But the same thing happens to me if I don't eat enough protein over a certain amount of time. I will start getting specifically what I call, because that's the thing that satiates it, protein
Mm-hmm.
hunger. So I think you can get there is an energy hunger, there is a protein hunger, and I think there probably is also a nutrient hunger, which which would be only satisfied if you're getting all the right nutrients. I,
Uh-huh.
I think there is we can't necessarily, when people say trust your body, I think, oh yeah, if I trusted my body, I'd weigh
Yeah,
250
sweet
pounds
Krispy
now.
Kreme. I'll have the Ben and Jerry's on top of the hot Krispy Kreme donut if I trust my body.
But on the other hand, I do think there may be, in the right context, a certain kind of ability for your body to lead you to the right foods based on certain nutrients. Like, I don't know, people argue about magnesium for chocolate, and I think that's kind of been debunked. But I think the basic idea, I think there may be some core truth to the basic idea that if you're missing a nutrient and you've experienced eating something that has given you that nutrient, your body might remember that and specifically crave it.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that would hold for macronutrients. That would maybe even hold for micronutrients as well, right? Yeah.
Sure. Protein's kind of funny because it's called a macronutrient because it can be made into
Mm-hmm.
calories, but mostly you don't want to be making too many calories out of protein. You want to use it for structure, and it's only a small proportion of it that becomes
Mm-hmm.
energy. It's funny, people talk about going back to the idea of excess protein. The way people talk about it, they make it sound like, oh, you ate protein, it all got used for structure, it's all being used for structure, and then suddenly you got too much, and so the rest of it's just going to be used for
Yeah.
calories. And of course, it's not like that at all. Like even at the beginning, there's always going to be a little bit of waste. There's always a bit that's used that gets
Yeah.
metabolized and a bit that's used for structure. And the more you eat, it changes. It's not linear. So the after a certain point, um, well, I don't even want to say after a certain point. The more protein that you eat, the more you
Yeah.
incorporate, but also the more you waste, and the proportion of that changes. So there's a certain, I'm gonna have to say it, there's a certain point at which the amount that's wasted is significantly more, and so
But it's not like there's this magic.
that
It's
all
not like there's
ties
a magic
into.
switch where it's like, oh, there's enough protein. Now it's going to be chocolate cake, or I mean, it's not. It's not really
Right,
so
right.
simple as that. Um, yeah.
Right. And so as long as it's being used for structure, you can think of protein almost like a
Hmm.
micronutrient. And you can say protein density is like nutrient density, um, except when it's not, except when you're using it for
Yeah.
calories and then it's
And
not.
that point
Uh,
might be
so,
different for different people depending on your level of, if you're insulin resistant, or I guess like, it's probably better to use the term hyperinsulinemic. If you're hyperinsulinemic, it may be different than somebody who's very insulin sensitive and has low fasting insulin. If you're not eating enough fat, you might get very different results. So I think this is a really good way of explaining it. You've brought a lot of nice nuance to it, because it's not just about eating as much protein as you can, and if you do that, you're going to be good. If you're getting insufficient fat, you're going to feel like crap. And the protein sparing modified fast is not sustainable for that reason, right? Lean chicken breast, these bodybuilder diets where they're doing lean chicken breast, skinless, boneless, lean chicken breast, and white rice with very, very low fat. Ends up being pretty high protein, and then just a bunch of fiber. A lot of them end up with wrecked guts, feeling like crap, thyroid issues, and there's it's not so simple as just stuff the protein in and you're going to be good. We need long-term adherence if we want health and longevity and sustained weight loss.
right. So the thing about the protein sparing modified fast is it's not just extremely high protein to energy ratio, but it's also protein restricted because if you were just to eat really like that high a protein to energy ratio ad libitum, you would be hungry. You would basically be experiencing what the explorers knew as rabbit starvation,
Hmm.
right? You've got all this protein, but you're not got enough energy. You're eating more protein because you want more energy, but all it's doing is causing more glucose, and what you really need is
Hmm.
fat. So these bodybuilder programs, and I'm sure they do work, especially for some people than
Yeah.
others, and when you're adding that hard cutoff of how much protein you're eating, um, it's it's um it's a protein restricted protocol. It's not just a movement on the arc of where your protein to energy ratio is.
Yeah.
So the protein sparing modified fast is kind of the reductio absurdum of protein to energy
Hmm.
ratio. And the reductio absurdum of nutrient density is a vitamin pill. So nutrient density is the idea that like the measurement is something is more nutrient dense if per calorie it has it meets more of your nutritional needs from a micronutrient
Hmm.
level. So so the idea behind that, people who are trying to say eat more nutrient dense foods, they're saying prefer something that for the same calories gives you more micronutrients, and there's a certain sense in which that makes. But but if you were just going to take that to the extreme in the same way as the protein sparing modified fast, you the hands down the best way to get the highest nutrient density diet, only eat vitamins
Hmm.
and eat no calories whatsoever. And obviously, that's not sustainable either in the same way. So
Hmm.
even if you generously threw in protein as a macronutrient, your highest nutrient density food is going to your diet is going to end up being energyless and therefore a very poor diet by my standards.
So yeah, that's a good segue into nutrient density, right? Like, why might nutrient density not be such an applicable term? We see, I mean, I've used this a lot myself, talking about the most nutrient dense foods being animal foods, right? But of course, we're talking about certain nutrients, right? You could make the argument that, well, carrots are the most nutrient dense food because they come with loads of vitamin A, beta carotene. So I guess we can cherry pick and we can make that word kind of mean a lot of different things. But yeah, what's your gripe with nutrient density? Why might we want to think twice about using that word so flippantly?
Well, the bottom line comes to what's under the bottom line, and that's energy. The whole metric is dividing out energy as if it's penalizing it. So a carrot is going to be, like you said, is going to be measured as more nutrient dense than liver because liver has some calories in it. And well, I don't know, maybe carrot is not the best example, but like say
Yeah.
spinach. Spinach is almost infinitely more nutrient dense than liver because it has almost no
Hmm.
calories. Does that mean you should never eat liver, or say a piece of steak, which also has a lot of nutrients in it, or an egg, for example, an egg yolk has so much
Yeah.
nutrition in it, so much vital nutrition. You can't really get it any other way um, than animal source foods to get that combination of like choline and the fatty acids and all those things that you need, but it comes along with energy, and this is being treated as if it's a bad thing. Where the truth is, we need the
Yeah, these are
energy,
high
so there's no
calorie
reason
foods.
to
It gets said like it's a naughty
penalize
thing.
it.
High calorie foods. I mean, why is that a bad thing? It's a funny thing. And yeah, you're right. Spinach, when you think about it on paper, spinach per pound, it must be so nutrient dense. But I mean, so much of that is fiber, so much of that indigestible material, and then also the
Right.
anti-nutrient content as well, the oxalate content, stuff like that could probably interfere with some other nutrients being absorbed. So I think if we're not taking these into account, then maybe we're not seeing the whole picture.
So if you tried to construct a diet to hit all the RDAs, and I have a whole other beef with that, which I've gone into before, and I've talked a lot about at the Carnivore conference. But supposing you just took the RDAs as an assumption for the moment, and you're trying to hit your RDAs based on
Yeah.
plant foods, and you were going to choose only the foods that had the highest nutrient density. That means you're penalizing anything that has any kind of energy in
Hmm.
it, including protein. Um, you're going to end up eating a whole bunch of stuff, and you're still not going to have met all your needs. And to me, that's highly problematic. Um, and you mentioned about how there are different nutrients as well. So yeah, if you already have your daily amount of vitamin A, then some other food that has vitamin A is going to continue to be nutrient dense, and it's not going to help you at all at the point you're in because now you need these other nutrients. And if you keep following this line of reasoning, basically you figure out that the ideal food is something that provides you all of the nutrients that you need in the correct amounts and ratios and provides energy and protein at the same time.
Hmm.
And that food happens to be meat, of course.
So we've got a balance of so many different elements that we've got to consider when we're looking at so-called nutrient density. Right? So what nutrients and in what context? Interesting. So what about food? When people say, well, nutrient density in organs is really important. So a lot of people say that, I mean, for one, I really enjoy eating foods like liver. I know you eat liver as well. We got like a whole shout out to Jessica for the book. So we could put a whole section on,
A
organs
beautiful book.
and how to use offal and use the whole animal in the Carnivore Cookbook. Which, yeah, we got you a copy. Yeah. Oh, you got some bookmarks in there too. That's cool.
I
No,
do.
we're so happy to finally have it out. So if you guys are interested, there's a link in the description. You can check out the Carnivore Cookbook. It's all animal foods, zero carb recipes for people who really love animals. But yeah, we put a lot of work into making sure that I mean, we like to eat kind of nose to tail, right? Because it's what's available. It's a little bit more affordable for us. It it's fun, and we really like these different. We like the variety. Some people they're doing great on just ribeyes. like not worrying about any of this
Hmm.
stuff at all. So I'm so remiss to tell people you must eat liver, you must eat organs. I never tell people they got to. I think it's interesting to try. I think it's fun to include a little bit more variety in there. But when you look at something like liver, certain nutrients you're not going to find those in such abundance in other foods. Vitamin A in the retinol form, some of these B vitamins available in there. There's really really high levels in liver. Um, for that reason, I like to say liver is a very nutrient dense food. But might I be, maybe making a mistake by saying liver would be more nutrient dense than something like muscle meat, right? Or like a nice ribeye.
Well, it's not technically false, and and I and I think it gets at the right idea. I mean, I tend to be picky semantically, but the reason that I'm picky with people about semantics is because I see every day people taking the literal meaning of a rule that you've made and and applying that without, using any extra brain power and coming up with ludicrous results. Um, so to say that an animal-based diet with some liver added is more nutrient dense, I think that's a meaningful and fair thing to say. But to say, don't eat high fat or don't add lard to your meal because it's not nutrient dense, or choose liver instead of
Ah,
lard,
right.
then that's when you're getting into a
Yeah,
problem.
and a lot of people say that. Well, if you're adding fat, hold on, they don't listen at all right now. All right. So a lot of people say that added fat is it's lacking nutrients, right? There's no nutrients in something like butter or something like beef fat, something like suet. There's not nutrients in there, and you'd be better off eating something else that's high in nutrition. Why might that be a little bit
Right.
short-sighted?
Right. And that's exactly where I have a problem because as we've been talking about for the whole time here, um, energy is a nutrient. Energy has all kinds of effects on things. Like if you eat fat, it's going to have effects on satiety hormones. It's going to have effects on your whole uh, hormonal insulin to glucagon milieu. It's going to have an effect on how much fat you can take from your own body stores, potentially even in a positive way, contrary to the intuition that eating fat might cause you to take less fat from your own body. There may be cases where it actually causes you to take more. So, so I think we should be really careful about talking about components of the diet as if they constituted the whole diet.
Yeah, kind of like the magic button type thing, where it's like, well, hey, if you're, no, I guess it one could maybe levy the same argument for people being told, okay, you're not losing weight, just eat more fat, right? Like eat more fat in the context of just eat more fat, so they'll eat everything they were eating and then they'll drink half a cup of MCT, and they're like, damn it, I'm still not losing weight, or I'm even gaining weight, So, but what might
Yeah.
be some better advice if somebody tells you, they tell you how much protein they're eating, they say they're getting sufficient protein, right? And then they're running into this wall, they're not losing weight, they're not feeling as good. Um, in what cases might it be a good idea to increase fat intake, and what other factors would you maybe want to manipulate or think about manipulating in the diet in order to improve fat loss, improve satiety, which leads to fat loss?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here is where I think we need to all really listen to each other and start compiling our data because we just don't have the full picture. Because it's if I were to say um, eating a higher protein to energy ratio is going to cause you to lose weight, I could point to you to a handful of people I know and interact with personally for whom that absolutely does not work.
Mm-hmm. Same
Um,
here.
and then the opposite is probably also true. I know people who upped their fat and it didn't cause them to lose weight, it may have caused them to gain weight. And so I don't want to go so far as to say that we're each special snowflakes. I mean, we definitely have to acknowledge that we're the same species, but there is a contextual component here, how ketogenic you are, if you have some kind of if you have anything going on in the body that's raising insulin, whether that's dysfunctional pancreas, you've got something going on with your adipose tissue, you've got a history of undereating, um, whether or not you're sensitive to plant intake can matter. I mean, I know that e- you've heard my story before, where when I stopped eating plants, basically was eating much, much more, and suddenly was dropping weight where I wasn't before.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the story that I don't want to get into in great detail right now is that 2 years ago, uh, it started about 2 years ago. I have gained weight, even though I haven't actually changed the way that I'm eating at
Oh,
all.
carnivore doesn't
And
work. You
so,
hear that, guys? Carnivore diet's broken. Here we
yeah, in
go.
the long term, it's bad for you.
Long term, it's going to destroy you.
No, but so I held the lowest weight that I had ever had for 2 years, and then that was from year 6 to year 8,
Mm-hmm.
and then I started gaining weight, and I've gained weight, and now I'm finding that if I eat a higher fat percentage, but not just like you were just saying, just kind of intuitively going for the higher fatty cuts, that didn't help me at all,
Mm-hmm.
but specifically targeting a very high fat ratio, the PKD style,
Yeah.
2 grams to 1 gram style, actually has had more of an effect than anything else I've tried over the past 2 years to troubleshoot this, including extended fasting, which kind of like protein sparing modified fast. Um, it didn't work for me. After a couple of days, I would get extremely cold, extremely hungry,
Yeah.
irritable, and it would just hit a wall in a way that I haven't done on this particular experiment.
So PKD, Paleolithic ketogenic diet, is a term that did they invent it? Did Paleo Medicina Group, did they invent that term?
They did, and I shouldn't really use that term because it's a trademark term, and
Ooh, you gotta pay
they're
up.
very frustrated. Well, it's not so much, I think, that they're worried about people claiming that their own work is somebody else's, but just in misrepresenting it because they have a very specific protocol, which
Yeah.
I'm not following to a T.
Yeah.
All I'm doing is taking those ratios. I've jokingly been calling it keto AF, where the AF stands for animal
Thought
foods.
it was
Um,
autofocus.
that's right. That's right.
That's pretty cool. I like that. I like the keto AF. That works. Ketovore maybe could be a good term. I've thrown that hashtag out there before, or ketogenic carnivorous ketogenic or ketogenic carnivorous diet. That it makes sense. I
It's
mean,
kind of funny because I've come sort of full circle. There was a really long time where being it's really humbling how much your own personal situation can affect your
uh,
theories, but for a long time my protein levels were probably around 35 to 40%, and it was working beautifully for me, and so I was very much into figuring out why that was and telling people about why protein is very safe and why they shouldn't worry about it.
yeah,
And now I find myself in a different situation. I don't exactly know why yet, but I'm learning that at least even for the same person at different times and in different contexts, different levels of protein might be better. So back to your question of what should you tell somebody if they're not getting to where they want to be, there's so many things that you could try. There are so many unsettled things in the carnivore community. Some people say eat less. Some people say eat more. Some people say eat more protein, but some people say eat more fat. Some people say eat less often. Some people say eat more often. And we don't even we don't know all the mechanisms behind it all, and so we can't accurately predict what's going to work for a particular individual at a particular
yeah.
time.
It can be really hard, right? It's like you people send me messages on Twitter and stuff, or not Twitter. I barely use Twitter. Instagram. People send me messages on Instagram, and they'll give me kind of a breakdown of what they're doing, and it's always never enough, right? It's always like, well, look, I wish I could give you a quick answer and just fix what's going on here, but really, there's 20 other questions that I would want to ask, right? So I think it becomes difficult. And when you said, we're not all snowflakes, we're not all, special snowflakes, totally agree. But I think what you were getting at there and what you were saying is really profound. It's like we're not all special snowflakes, but there are there are so many variables that can be adjusted, that can be looked at, meal timing, meal frequency, light exposure, sleep quality. I mean, these are just outside of the composition of the macronutrients. There's so many things that affect um, how our body's affected by macronutrient manipulation, caloric manipulation, and stuff that each individual context does. They all vary, right? But it's not, the variables don't vary. Like the variables are the same for everybody, right? So
Yeah.
those are basically, there are the variables, but there are so many of them to take into account that it does almost seem like, oh, that's just you, you're just a unique freak that, behaves, that reacts differently to modifications. But yeah, I don't think we're special snowflakes, but there are a lot of variables that people don't even think about that are going to play an important role. Like you said, protein not being the magic wand that you can just wave at fat loss. There's some nuance to it, and nutrient density is another one. I think you said something really interesting about high nutrient foods, or certain nutrients that we might crave, um, perhaps lowering hunger. And that's a theory that a lot of people have talked about. Weston A. Price kind of hits on that too, with his factor X of for health and for building the body. But do you think that this is something that's important for people to look at? Like, do you ever tell people to maybe include foods like liver in order to try to blunt hunger by satisfying certain macronutrient, not macronutrient, but micronutrient, or perhaps fat soluble vitamin needs? Do you think that this is a viable approach sometimes, or?
Sure. I mean, there is one hill that I continue to stand on, at least for now, and that's that I don't think continuing to do something that is leaving you feeling hungry can be good. Even if it's creating a caloric deficit,
Mhm.
the signal of hunger, I feel strongly that it's telling you that you're not getting enough of something. And it, if you're able to make yourself get it from your own body, in the case of energy, that might be the trick. But if there is a nutrient that you're missing, um, then I think you're going to feel like eating, and then that is something that you should really take seriously.
Yeah. Someone says in the chat, we are special snowflakes in different environments at different ages. So, we are special snowflakes in different environments at different ages. That's a funny way of putting it. People are renaming the diet too. You've got keto AF. Andrew Scarborough says carnisexual. So those are, it's like, we're just, if you're carnisexual, then
Not going there.
carnisexual would mean that you're attracted to anybody that eats a carnivorous diet. Uh, that's, I
Oh.
guess. So we got some funny people in the chat here. A lot of people talking about the importance of N=1, and Josh Blackburn's up in the chat. Logical Links, he talks about that as well. And I know he's somebody who's benefited just like you from more of a keto AF approach, a more along the lines of the PKD type approach, but not using their exact protocol. And yeah, I think this is. I think it's really important for people to take the nuance into account. And I really love how you bring that nuance to the table. And I really like the way that you explain it, and you get into the deep stuff, and you're able to explain it a lot better than other people. So we talked about several hormones. Now, is leptin something that you've looked much into? Have you studied deeply into leptin resistance, stuff like that? Someone in the chat's asking about that as well.
I don't know a lot about leptin. I know I mentioned It's the Woo earlier, and she talks a lot about leptin. She studied it and had some leptin intervention, I believe, at a certain point. When I first heard about leptin, there was something called a leptin protocol. It involved doing things like, well, eating low carb and eating first thing in the morning. And I was very skeptical about the protocol itself because I looked at each component of it, and every one of those components could be explained by insulin theory just as well as by leptin theory. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't more to understand by understanding the mechanics of leptin, but it's not something I have any expertise on.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think the leptin, it's something that I've looked at a little bit, but it seems like the research just, I mean, it's not very complete. People have told me about the leptin trials where they were giving exogenous leptin and getting reversals of obesity and diabetes with it, but I haven't looked too deep into it. That's just at this point, it's not something I've studied at all. Um, So
Right.
yeah,
So the trick is how do you make that happen endogenously? Because exogenously, it doesn't fix it, and then you take away the leptin and it goes away. The problems come right back, as far as I understand.
okay.
So what you need to do is you, if leptin's going to be useful, it's going to be by figuring out what to do to make your leptin response look like someone's response for someone who isn't post-obese. Because I think that's where the problem comes, is for someone who's had a weight problem and has lost the weight, but their adipose tissue is still acting like someone who is overweight. Um, so I don't know in practice what that's going to look like if we're going to learn something different from the manipulations we're already doing.
Yeah, so somehow improving leptin sensitivity, um, much like insulin sensitivity. So, all right. Well, I think we've gone pretty deep. Is there anything else? Is there anything we forgot? Is there anything you were itching to talk about that we might have omitted?
I don't think so.
Awesome.
We
Well,
covered it all.
what is your new blog called? A lot of people might be wondering where they can find more of your information, where they can find more of Amber O'Hearn. Where can they find you out there? I know on Twitter you are at Keto Carnivore. And you guys make
That's
sure to
right.
follow her on Twitter. She's always you see her very generous with answering questions, at least if they interest you. And I see you very active over there and helping a lot of people out to understand the deeper issues. I see you in some debates sometimes, which always fascinate me. And I think you and Ted Naiman having a little bit of an exchange concerning some of the protein stuff.
Yeah, it was a lot about what we're talking about here today. I have to say, I love Ted's work, and I just have certain things that um, I don't quite agree with, which is normal because I think that we don't understand everything perfectly, and that's specifically about whether the protein, whether adding energy to the diet is going to necessarily cause you to gain fat. And I think we have a disagreement about that. But
Yeah.
we were talking about um, the role of meat and the level of fat in a prehistoric diet, which isn't, of course, known exactly. And I was
Yeah.
arguing that it may have been fatter than he thinks.
Yeah, yeah, that's an interesting thing, right? I mean, with better bigger, fatter animals, the composition of a diet would definitely be more fatty. I know my favorite parts of the animal are like the bone marrow, really,
Hmm.
really fatty steaks, stuff like that. I mean, that's what I'm going for. So again, shout out to the Carnivore Cookbook from Jessica. That's why we put a lot of these recipes in there to show you how to make foods like bone marrow, how to even render your own fat, make your own tallow. Show you how to make pemmican, which is another one of my favorite foods. Although I like the unrendered fat better than rendered fat. Um, what about you? Rendered fat versus unrendered fat? Do you find there's a difference in digestibility?
It's funny that you asked that because yes, I do definitely find a difference in digestibility if I'm eating them on their own. If I eat liquid rendered fat or even cooled room temperature rendered fat, it very often will cause me digestive upset without eating too much extra. Whereas if I eat raw fat or cured fat, which is essentially raw in its
Yeah.
properties, I don't get that at all. But interestingly, and this is surprising, and I don't understand why it is. If I mix rendered fat into something like pemmican, or even into a sort of meat pate that may have fresh cooked meat rather than
Hmm.
dried meat in it, um, I don't have any digestibility problem with
Interesting.
that. And I don't know if it's the protein slowing it down or what that is at
Yeah.
all.
Interesting. I notice, I like cracklings. Like after you make, if you render fat, then you get the cracklings at the end. They're so good. But if I eat a lot of them, like I feel like they kind of go right through me, and you get the floaters in the toilet and stuff. It doesn't seem to digest as well as like you said, the raw
Yeah.
fat, or if you got a really fatty steak, or if I what I like to do is I'll take the suet and I'll just cut slabs of it and throw it on the pan at the end and just warm it up a little bit on one or maybe both sides, just so it's slightly softened, and I'll eat it like that. So it's raw in the middle, a little softened on the outside. That digests so easily. So I think there's definitely something to
It
that.
does.
Definitely something to it. But pemmican's really cool food. So if you guys maybe check out the book, we show you how to make pemmican in there. But yeah, so you got your blog. Where's your blog, Amber O'Hearn?
I have two. The original one was ketotic.org, and on that one, I tend to be analyzing studies, and it's always very well referenced where I think that the science is really pointing. And then I have Empirica with the ca is a .ca because I'm Canadian. Um, and that tends to be more stuff about the meat diet and more speculation or essays that I've written without the heavy science as much.
Nice. So empiri.ca. And I'll throw a link. I'll pin the pinned comment on this will be some links to your blogs, and maybe I'll throw a link to her Twitter as well. So you check out the pinned comment on the YouTube video here. We had one super chat. Major Powell says, "Thanks for all you do, Amber." He says you're amazing.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much. Thank you for inviting me.
Likewise, likewise. So I agree. Amber's amazing. She does a lot of good work out there, and a great representative of carnivory. And I love that she's always asking the hard questions and exploring these things with an open mind, and reaching out an olive branch and having discussions with guys like Ted, who Ted Naiman does a lot of great work. She has slight disagreements with him, and it's always interesting to see her hashing out these ideas in a civil way. And so we all appreciate it. Thanks a lot for coming on, Amber. Empiri.ca. You can find more. Bye, guys.